Hello! Today we're looking at IVER live woods, but the animated version. And there's already a part 1. Today in part 2 we're going to be looking at creating the woods environment and then putting everything together for the final end result. So let's get into it. We are heading into the woods and we're kicking things off where we started off in the last video with the full concert environment, and I've just duplicated that comp and I'm basically getting rid of everything. What I want to keep is the camera movement, I want to keep the character placement, and that's kind of it, because we're going to be recreating the entire environment in a different style, and we're going to be using some photos of trees to start things off. So I have this folder of trees, I'll just go with that one, import that, and then we'll use that as the kicking off point. So I put that into its own composition and just setting down a guide for the ground position of that tree. And this is going to be important later on when we switch up the trees for a few different designs. Now I'm creating a circle, and this is really just going to be used as my guide layer for where I want to place these trees. So my idea that I had going into this was I want the character in place, he's going to be in focus, and then to create a woods environment, there's 1,000 different ways of doing that. But a cool thing that we can do in animation that we kind of wouldn't be able to do otherwise is to have a bunch of trees circling around him. So he is the center of the scene, and then we have a bunch of trees just moving around in a circle, and they can move throughout the entire piece, giving more movement to the environment, just like we have the crowd and the lights and everything else. In the concert environment, this is an easy way of introducing a bit more of something happening throughout this environment, and then I'm still able to art direct and control the movement and placement of everything on top of that. But just having them continuously spin around creates a pretty cool environment here. And I'm just using one tree at the moment. Again, we'll change up that later, but this is just to build out the rough structure of what I want the animation to do before diving too much into visual details and looking at things too much. So I have one layer of trees, I have another layer of trees closer to the camera spinning in the opposite direction, and for the third layer I want to place a smaller circle closer to him that's not going to end up using trees, but it's going to end up using some small plants and things instead. So again, I have another folder of elements like this, just PNG files that I can pull in here, and then I can go ahead and just align all of these in their own compositions to the same ground line that I put in place before for the very first tree. So this is just to simplify things and avoid headaches when I want to replace elements in the scene. I want to make sure that all of them are placed on the exact same Y position to make them be on the ground firmly. And then I'm adding a big sort of forest environment, again just using a photo in the background and using 2 separate layers of that just to get even more depth into the scene. And now we want to go ahead and just bring in a bunch of different trees and switch them up. So I'm using some dead trees or some sort of fall/winter trees, and then we're also going to be using some that have more leaves on them, so we have a full forest environment of a bunch of different ones. And I'm just going through all of these individually. This is kind of the most boring part of just making sure that they're aligned and centered to that ground line and then centered in their own composition, so it's going to be easy to replace them in the comp here. Big fan of using CC toner as well, just to tint different layers and try out different looks. So I've gone ahead and done that for the background. Everything is this kind of milky beige orange tone at the moment to have a little bit of a fall autumn vibe, and maybe we stick with that, maybe we end up changing it, but that's a nice way of working with just the CC toner effect to switch up the way that original photos look that can be kind of boring and kind of too simple. And we'll go ahead and make some big updates to the trees a little bit later on as well. I'm just going through and checking the movement. I do want trees in the foreground, but I don't want them to end up being too distracting when they're going in front of the camera and covering up the character. Another part that I want to do here is just add a bit of shadow under the trees. I've created a separate composition for the shadow, and then I just need to go through and add that to every single comp, because this is not something I thought of from the beginning. It's something that I came up with, but I do want to make sure that that shadow is included into every composition of the trees and plants, so they all feel firmly stuck to the ground and part of the environment in a better way. We'll just go ahead and add some foreground elements using the same plants that we have close to him, but I'm just importing that as a separate comp and placing that much closer to the camera. And we're still using the camera lens blur that we set up in the concert version, so that's blurring everything on the edges. So that means that the things in the left and right corners of the screen here are going to be out of focus, and that's exactly the way that I want it to look. Another part of being in the forest is anchoring the character in here. A nice way of doing that is adding some shadows like this, kind of based on the leaves of the trees. So if the sun was to be shining down on him in that forest environment and there's trees above it, those trees and those leaves obviously would cast a shadow. And they would cast a shadow on the ground, which is what I'm working on now, but they would also cast a shadow on him. So I'm adding a separate version of it, and I'm just animating that layer from left to right, so it has a little bit of movement throughout the animation. And then I'm going to use him as a matte, so this leaf layer only shows up on top of him. And then I just need to add a black fill and turn down the opacity, and pretty quickly we have something that looks like sun shining down on him, leaves casting a shadow on him, and casting a shadow on the ground as well, to make this whole environment tie itself together even better. A fun idea I came up with while working on this was I was looking at the trees and I felt like these are kind of boring, so I'm gonna try out the posterize effect to just turn down the number of colors available. This is really like compressing the number of colors or converting it into like a GIF or something. But then on top of that, I can use the CC toner that I talked about before of changing the highlights, midtones, and shadows, and really deciding on these colors to create a way more sci-fi-y looking kind of tree, where it's being tinted to different colors that of course it wouldn't in the real world. But this is a pretty fun effect, giving it its own spin. And on top of that, I also want to go ahead and just add a mosaic effect to just make it again feel a little bit more compressed, not necessarily creating something super pixel art based, but it's sort of going in that direction. And with the mosaic effect, you can control the number of basically pixels that you want to show. So I'm just using this as a fun technique of switching up the trees where they don't look like random photos that are just pulled in. They kind of feel like this weird made up sci-fi-ish environment that, again, I think goes in sync with the song and the way that it sounds, because that also feels very otherworldly, especially the live version. I think this environment fits very well with the way that it sounds to my ears. And for the colors, I can just switch that up however I wanted to. I don't have to stick to the real world. We can have shadows being blue, shadows being red. We can have plants being blue. Just having fun with it and coming up with something that feels like it fits for the overall vibe that I'm going for. So, as mentioned before, they are continuously rotating, but another thing that I ended up doing was in sync with parts of the song where certain things happen that I want to highlight even more, to the way that he sings, to the way that the music sounds. When something like extra exciting is happening, I can also animate the trees manually on top of this. And to do that, I'm just animating the control layers for the trees. So I can have them scale up or scale down. I can have them rotate quicker in certain sections, just to make it feel like there's a little bit more control to this environment. It's not just trees rotating for 3.5 minutes. There is a little bit more stuff happening when I decide that something specific should happen. Exact same process as we did with the lights for the concert environment, where I can fade up and fade down the lights when I want them, but they're always on, they're always moving, giving a little bit more stuff happening. And now we're heading into Premiere Pro, where I'm doing the final edits of everything, and I typically for renders like this that are very heavy, both of these environments, the concert environment and the woods environment, ended up taking around 2 hours each to render from After Effects. So final tweaking on the visuals, like just adding a little bit of grain and stuff, I prefer to do that in Premiere Pro because that doesn't affect the render times. And then I'm just stacking the woods environment on top of the forest environment on video 1 and video 2. And I'm going through and cutting and editing and seeing where do I want to cut to the different environments. And because we have the exact same camera animation in both of these animations, they're both based on the same concert comp that I created first, I can very easily do match cuts between the concert and the woods, where the camera and the character and everything is in the exact same place. And this is also one of those cool effects that is not very complicated, but there's some planning that goes into it, and actually thinking about when I created the concert environment, I want to be able to do these match cuts between the two different environments. They can feel a little bit jarring sometimes, so a trick that I like to use that I think also fits with the style is to just use some real footage elements like these film burns to hide those cuts or to blend those cuts together. So I'm importing a piece of footage with just a film burn effect like this, and I'm setting that to add, and then I can just put that in the timeline where all of these cuts are happening. And that's what I'm going through and doing here. Just using a few different variations of that film burn effect and just placing that right on the cut between the concert and the woods environment to blend that together a little bit more, make those two worlds feel part of the same overall look and feel. And I'm also adding those elements to when it's cutting back out of the forest environment into the concert. So it's a lot of layers in here, but it's very simple what they're doing. And I'm just using a couple frames or like a second max of those elements to just tie the whole thing together. And with that, I pretty much have everything in place. I'm just going through and making a few final tweaks, and then I go, oh yeah, that looks nice.